June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were no longer quiet stretches of sand. They had become the threshold of history, roaring with fire, steel, and the cries of men thrown into a storm. Before dawn, shadows moved across the channel, an armada of nearly 7,000 ships pushing through gray waters under a veil of fog and gun smoke. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, the largest seaborne invasion in history was unfolding. German defenders at Omaha and Utah watched in disbelief as the sea itself seemed alive, swarming with landing craft that advanced without hesitation. Shells ripped the shoreline, earth trembled, and bunkers shuddered as if the Atlantic wall were being torn apart by the weight of an empire. The Germans had long feared a Western landing, but in Tokyo, half a world away, the news would strike with even greater force. For Japanese commanders, already stretched thin across the Pacific, the sudden reality of a second front in Europe carried a chilling implication. America's industrial machine was proving so vast, so relentless, that it could fight two titanic wars at once. On that morning, German officers along the coast of Normandy reported waves of tanks and infantry pushing inland. American paratroopers had dropped deep behind enemy lines during the night, cutting railways, sabotaging communication hubs, and seizing crossroads before German reserves could respond. To those standing on the cliffs above Omaha, it looked impossible, yet the Americans kept coming, wave after wave, as though no casualty could stem the tide. Radios crackled with German voices thick with panic. Zu viel. Too many. They had expected delays, confusion, perhaps even failure. What they saw instead was an enemy that had learned, adapted, and was now executing an invasion of terrifying precision. But the true shock did not rest only on German shoulders. Thousands of miles away, in Tokyo, intelligence reports confirmed what many in the Japanese high command had dreaded since Pearl Harbor. The United States had opened a full-scale European invasion while still overwhelming Japanese forces across the Pacific. It was a thunderclap across Asia, a signal that the American war effort was far from fractured. It was coordinated, determined, and seemingly unstoppable. In the humid war rooms of Tokyo, news of D-Day arrived with an almost surreal weight. Maps of the Pacific already showed creeping American advances: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and soon the Marianas. Carrier groups roamed the seas like floating fortresses, striking with impunity, backed by factories that produced aircraft and warships faster than Japan could sink them. Now, on June 6, 1944, word came that 150,000 Allied soldiers had stormed ashore in France. Supported by thousands of aircraft and naval guns larger than any artillery in the Pacific. For Japanese officers, the realization was devastating. The very strategy they had relied upon, the belief that America could not fight two major wars on opposite sides of the globe, was unraveling before their eyes. Their gamble in December 1941 had been simple: strike hard, shatter American will, and secure enough territory that Washington would negotiate rather than bleed itself dry. Yet D-Day proved the opposite. America had not only refused to negotiate, but it had also built a war machine capable of toppling empires simultaneously. The beaches of Normandy were only the surface of this revelation. Behind the assault lay a staggering level of coordination. 35 Allied divisions prepared for the invasion, supported by more than 11,000 aircraft. American factories had already produced over 80,000 landing craft, from small Higgins boats to massive LSTs capable of carrying tanks directly onto the beaches. Soldiers poured across the channel not as desperate men clinging to survival, but as the spearhead of a juggernaut that had prepared for years. When German bunkers were finally silenced, when paratroopers linked up with armored units, when the American flag rose above shattered French villages, the world could see the truth. The United States was no longer an untested force. It had become the decisive weight on the scale of global war. Back in Japan, whispers spread among officers that the Americans had accomplished something the Imperial General Staff had considered unthinkable. Their own empire, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, was straining to maintain supply lines and defend outposts. Soldiers on Pacific islands rationed food, drank from polluted streams, and dug into coral caves, waiting for the inevitable American onslaught. Yet those same Americans now had the strength to pour armies into France to challenge the heart of German power while still maintaining pressure across Asia. It was not just the scale, it was the message. The Allies had declared that the liberation of Europe and the destruction of the Third Reich would continue without pause, no matter the cost. And for Japan, the nightmare deepened. Once Germany fell, once Hitler was crushed beneath the weight of two fronts, the full fury of America could be turned eastward. The psychological shock was immense. Diaries of Japanese officers captured later revealed disbelief that a democracy, so often portrayed as weak and divided, could summon such unity and power. Some clung to hope that Germany might yet repel the invasion, that the Atlantic Wall could somehow hold. Others saw the writing on the wall. D-Day was not merely an invasion of France. It was a signal to the world that the Axis was being strangled from all sides. The myth of invincibility that had driven Japan's expansion was collapsing. At Normandy, the Americans had demonstrated they could strike wherever they chose, on a scale that dwarfed anything Japan could mount. If they could land in France while still hammering the Pacific, what hope remained when the war inevitably turned its full weight toward Tokyo? As the beaches turned red with sacrifice, as the dead and wounded littered the sand, the larger truth was already written. D-Day was not just about Normandy, not just about breaking Hitler's grip on Europe. It was about proving that the United States was waging a global war with a machine of steel, industry, and resolve unmatched in history. For the Japanese High Command, the news was a thunderous reminder. The tide had turned, and it was no longer possible to imagine a divided enemy. America had chosen to fight on every front, and it had the means to win by the summer of 1944. The Second World War had become a conflict of sheer scale, measured not only in miles of territory, but in the capacity of nations to endure. The Axis powers had begun the war with swift advances and a confidence rooted in years of preparation. Germany, with its blitzkrieg doctrine, had swept across Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union, carving out an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Japan, striking at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, had gambled everything on a lightning offensive that carried its armies across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. For nearly 3 years, both nations believed that their opponents lacked the will or the resources to sustain a global fight. Yet by mid-1944, that illusion was unraveling. In Europe, the Soviets were surging westward, reclaiming cities like Kiev and Minsk. In the Mediterranean, Italy had fallen, its once proud fascist regime reduced to a battleground where German divisions fought desperately to slow the Allied advance. And in the Pacific, the Japanese were watching island after island fall, their fleets mauled by American carrier groups that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The war was shifting, and for the Axis, the nightmare of a two-front struggle was becoming reality. For Adolf Hitler, the prospect of an Allied landing in Western Europe had always been the greatest danger. Since 1942, he had poured resources into the Atlantic Wall, a massive network of bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles stretching from Norway to the French-Spanish border. Concrete and steel were meant to harden the coastline against invasion, to make any attempt so costly that the Allies would be forced to turn elsewhere. Yet behind the propaganda, German commanders knew the truth. Defenses stretched too thin could be broken. When the storm finally came, they could only hope reinforcements would arrive in time. In Tokyo, however, few had imagined the Western Allies would risk such an operation while still fighting a massive war in the Pacific. The Japanese strategy depended on precisely this assumption, that America could not project overwhelming force across two oceans simultaneously. The very idea defied their understanding of logistics, manpower, and industrial capacity. That assumption would prove fatal. America, unlike its adversaries, had embraced a war of production from the outset. President Franklin Roosevelt's famous declaration that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy was no empty phrase. By 1943, American shipyards launched more vessels each year than Japan had launched in the entire preceding decade. Automobile plants converted to tank production. Assembly lines churned out thousands of aircraft monthly, and factories spread across the Midwest and South delivered artillery, radios, and rations in quantities that seemed limitless. This was not a nation straining to keep pace. It was a nation surging ahead, fueled by a workforce that included millions of women, immigrants, and African Americans who had stepped into roles once denied to them. Every bull tightened, and every bullet packed carried with it the weight of a country determined to outproduce its enemies into submission. For Japan, whose industrial base relied heavily on imported raw materials and limited factory capacity, the contrast was devastating. The American war machine had become a colossus that could strike in Europe and the Pacific without faltering. Yet context alone does not explain the scale of shock that rippled through Japan on June 6th. The Pacific War had drained Japan of resources and manpower. Vast territories required occupation, supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, and Allied submarines prowled with increasing effectiveness, strangling shipping routes. By 1944, fuel was scarce, steel was rationed, and factories worked under constant threat of American bombing raids. Japanese soldiers dug into island fortresses with the grim knowledge that resupply was uncertain and reinforcements unlikely. Every campaign, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, had bled divisions dry. And yet, as Japan struggled to hold on, the Americans prepared to hurl entire armies across the channel. It was not merely a question of geography. It was a demonstration that Japan's most fundamental assumption, that America could be stretched too thin, was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The German-Japanese alliance had always been one of convenience rather than coordination. The two nations shared enemies but fought separate wars, each expecting the other to tie down resources that might otherwise shift across theaters. For Tokyo, the hope was that Germany's dominance in Europe would prevent America from committing fully to the Pacific. As long as Hitler threatened Britain and the Soviet Union, Washington would be forced to divide its strength. But when Allied soldiers landed in Normandy, Japan saw the danger with new clarity. The United States had not divided its strength, it had multiplied it. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh fed both the 8th Air Force over Germany and the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. Shipyards in California produced carriers that fought in the Philippine Sea, while New York docks loaded Liberty ships bound for Europe. Never before in history had a nation waged two wars of such scale with such coordination. From the German perspective, the invasion of Normandy was the culmination of years of dread. Hitler's generals had warned that the Atlantic Wall could only delay, not prevent, a determined assault. They had pleaded for armored divisions to be kept inland, ready to counterattack once the enemy landed. Hitler, mistrustful and erratic, kept many of these reserves under his personal command, and on June 6th, the confusion of authority slowed the response that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea. As American, British, and Canadian troops carved footholds on the beaches, German units scrambled without clear orders. Reports of paratroopers sowing chaos behind the lines only added to the panic. For Japan, watching from afar, the message was grim. If Germany, with its battle-hardened armies and fortified coastlines, could be breached in a single day, what chance did Japan's scattered garrisons have against the same relentless tide? Even the political dimension added weight to Japan's dread. The Allied coalition, fragile in its early days, had matured into a coordinated machine. Britain provided leadership, bases, and experience. The Soviet Union tied down millions of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Canada, Australia, and countless smaller nations contributed troops, ships, and resources. And the United States, with its immense industry, bound it all together. The landings in Normandy symbolized this unity, forces from across the globe fighting side by side against tyranny. For Tokyo, isolated and increasingly alone, it was a chilling contrast. The so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, promised as a partnership, had devolved into domination and resentment. Occupied nations seethed under Japanese rule, their resources drained to feed the empire's war effort. Resistance movements grew, and morale waned. Against this backdrop, the sight of Allied nations cooperating in the largest invasion in history underscored the weakness of Japan's own position. The historical context of D-Day, then, was more than the opening of a second front. It was the moment when the full scale of American commitment revealed itself, not only to Germany but also to Japan. The belief that democracies could not fight total wars had been shattered. The expectation that industry could not sustain two global theaters had been disproven, and the assumption that Axis powers could rely on one another's pressure to hold the enemy back had collapsed. By June 1944, the world had changed. The storm that broke over Normandy was not confined to France. It swept across continents, shaking capitals from Berlin to Tokyo. For Japan, watching the tide rise higher each day, the realization grew that their empire's days were numbered. The thunder of artillery at Normandy told the world that America had arrived on European soil. But for the Japanese high command, the greater terror lay hidden beneath the surface of numbers and smoke. It was not simply that Allied soldiers had stormed ashore. It was how they had done it. The Axis had assumed that any invasion across the English Channel would demand months of buildup, a fragile gamble of supply and timing. Yet when the blow fell on June 6, 1944, it struck with such precision and coordination that it seemed less a gamble than a foregone conclusion. For the Japanese, accustomed to planning operations around scarce fuel, limited shipping, and overstretched armies, the hidden advantage of America's war effort was not just its vast resources. It was its ability to synchronize those resources into a war machine that could land men and steel on two distant shores simultaneously. The hidden edge was not merely strength. It was organization on a scale the world had never seen. Reports from Normandy stunned observers. American landing craft moved in endless waves, perfectly timed, delivering infantry, tanks, and supplies to beaches under fire. Paratroopers descended miles inland, coordinated with naval bombardments that silenced German guns just minutes before troops hit the sand. The entire invasion was choreographed with radios, code names, deception operations, and logistics chains that stretched back across the Atlantic. It was a symphony of violence, each note played at the right moment. Japanese intelligence officers, reading intercepted reports and diplomatic cables, recognized the terrifying implication. This was not improvisation. This was mastery. The United States had harnessed technology and industry into a single organism, capable of projecting overwhelming force with uncanny precision. For a nation like Japan, already struggling to supply its garrisons in the Pacific, the contrast was damning. The hidden advantage lay first in communication. From the very beginning, American forces relied on frequency-modulated radios that allowed clear, secure communication even amid the chaos of battle. In Normandy, commanders could adjust landings in real time, redirecting units where resistance was strongest or exploiting gaps as they appeared. On Saipan, just days later, those same radios would allow American fleets and Marines to coordinate across miles of battlefield. Japanese forces, by contrast, relied on equipment prone to interference. With limited range and vulnerability to interception, messages were often moved by courier or signal flags, too slow for the pace of modern mechanized war. To Tokyo's officers, the reports from Normandy carried an eerie familiarity, what they saw the Americans doing to Germany. They had already felt on Pacific Islands, battles where Japanese counterattacks stumbled into ambushes, where artillery fell silent because orders never arrived, and where American coordination seemed uncanny. Normandy confirmed it was no accident. It was the product of a system designed for speed and flexibility. Logistics formed the second pillar of this hidden advantage. At Normandy, Americans had not only landed men and tanks, they had brought entire harbors with them. Prefabricated piers, known as Mulberries, floated into place within days, allowing the Allies to unload thousands of tons of supplies directly onto beaches that had never seen a port. Pipelines were laid under the English Channel, pumping fuel to advancing armies. It was innovation fused with scale. For Japan, this was almost unimaginable. Their war effort relied on fragile shipping routes vulnerable to American submarines and aircraft. Every gallon of fuel, every bag of rice, had to be ferried across seas increasingly controlled by the enemy. Where Americans created new harbors out of steel and ingenuity, Japanese garrisons were often starved, cut off, and forgotten. The lesson was brutal. America was not improvising victory. It was engineering it. The third advantage, less visible but no less decisive, was deception. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate ruse that convinced Hitler an invasion would come at Pas de Calais, ensured that German reserves were mispositioned when the real landings occurred. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and double agents kept the Germans guessing until it was too late. Japanese intelligence, learning of these operations after the fact, understood the deeper meaning. America's strength was not simply brute force, it was cunning. In the Pacific, too, they had seen signs, feints that drew defenders away. Sudden landings on unexpected beaches, and island assaults where Japanese commanders realized too late that they had been watching the wrong horizon. Normandy proved that deception was now an American art form, one practiced at the highest level. Japan, by contrast, often relied on rigid planning and the belief that spirit and sacrifice could overcome weakness. Against an enemy who combined overwhelming industry with misdirection, that faith was increasingly hollow. Perhaps the most devastating hidden advantage of all, however, was psychological. For years, Japanese leaders had clung to the belief that democracies lacked the stomach for prolonged war. They had gambled that the shock of Pearl Harbor would break American resolve, that casualties would sap its will, and that internal divisions would tear it apart. Normandy shattered that illusion as surely as the German bunkers had been shattered by naval gunfire. To launch the invasion, the United States had mobilized not only its armies but also its entire society. Citizens rationed gasoline and sugar, factories worked night shifts, women filled production lines, and children collected scrap metal. It was total war, embraced not reluctantly, but with determination. Japanese officers, steeped in the ideology of sacrifice, had underestimated the resilience of free nations. Normandy revealed the truth. The Americans were prepared to pay the price, in blood and steel, to see the war through to its end. To German commanders, the shock of the invasion was immediate and tactical. To Japan, it was strategic and existential. If America could pour 150,000 men into France in a single day while simultaneously driving across the Central Pacific, then the future was clear. The war could no longer be won by holding islands or delaying battles. The tide was rising, unstoppable, and it would sweep across both oceans. Reports from the beaches of Normandy were more than battlefield updates. They were warnings written in blood and sand. Warnings that Japan's greatest fear was becoming reality, that America's hidden advantage was not just its machines, not just its numbers, but its ability to fight everywhere at once and never falter. Normandy was not just a second front. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the scale of power that America wielded. To the Japanese High Command, watching from across the Pacific, it was a terrifying vision of the future. Once Germany fell, that storm of men and steel would turn eastward, and there would be no wall, no island, no fortress capable of holding it back. The roar of engines across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, was the sound of industry unleashed. For the soldiers storming Omaha Beach, the invasion was chaos, mud, and blood. For the Japanese High Command, analyzing reports from their German allies, the invasion revealed something far more profound. America's hidden advantage was not merely its courage or numbers. It was the machinery that made those numbers possible. Beneath every landing craft, behind every tank that rolled onto the beaches, there was a web of factories, engineers, and technologies working with a precision no Axis power could hope to match. To understand why D-Day terrified Tokyo as much as Berlin, one must look beyond the battlefield into the heart of America's technical war machine. Start with the humble landing craft. To most observers, they were simple boxes of steel, flat-bottomed boats with ramps that dropped into surf. Yet the Higgins boat, officially known as the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, was more than a vessel. It was a revolution. Designed by Andrew Higgins, a Louisiana boat builder, the craft measured 36 feet, was powered by a gray marine diesel engine, and could carry 36 men, a jeep, or 8,000 pounds of cargo directly onto a beach. With a draft of only 3 feet, it could skim across shallow waters, run aground, and back off under fire. More than 20,000 of these boats were built, most in factories that had once produced furniture and automobiles. In Normandy, waves of Higgins boats delivered infantry into the jaws of German fire, but their true power was logistical. They allowed the United States to strike anywhere there was sand. In the Pacific, Japanese defenders had already learned to dread them at Tarawa and Saipan. In France, Germany felt their sting. For Japan, Reading the numbers was sobering. These boats were being mass-produced by the thousands, while their own forces relied on improvised barges and slow transports vulnerable to submarine and air attack. The technology of communication was just as decisive. The American SCR-508 radio, weighing 181 pounds, crystal-controlled, and capable of broadcasting over 10 miles even under heavy interference, became the nervous system of armored and infantry units alike. German forces, clinging to the Fug-5 with limited range and constant static, found themselves outmaneuvered not only in Normandy but across Europe. Japanese forces, even more disadvantaged, often lacked radios entirely, relying on runners or wired telephones easily severed in combat. The result was stark. American commanders could adapt in minutes, shifting artillery fire, calling in air support, or redirecting units where needed. At Normandy, this meant reinforcing breakthroughs before German reserves could close them. In the Pacific, it meant adjusting naval bombardments in real time. For Tokyo's generals, the realization was grim. America's advantage was not brute force alone. It was a web of invisible signals binding every unit into one coherent, adaptable army. Even the engineering of the invasion itself carried technical marvels. The Mulberry harbors, constructed from prefabricated concrete caissons known as Phoenix units, allowed the Allies to create artificial ports along the French coast within days of landing. Each harbor, stretching nearly a mile, could handle thousands of tons of cargo per day. Combined with the Pluto pipeline under the ocean project, which pumped fuel directly from England to France, these innovations meant the Allied armies would never run dry of supplies. Japanese officers, accustomed to fighting desperate battles where fuel shortages crippled operations, understood immediately what this meant. The Americans had removed the greatest vulnerability of amphibious warfare, resupply. Where Japan had to abandon garrisons on islands once cut off, the Allies could feed entire armies through floating ports and underwater pipelines. It was industrial ingenuity turned into military dominance. Airpower, too, displayed America's technical superiority. Over Normandy, more than 11,000 aircraft filled the skies, ranging from P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts to C-47 Dakotas dropping paratroopers. Each sortie was guided by intricate planning, radar coordination, and ground-to-air communication that allowed strikes to be called in with near-surgical precision. Japanese forces had already seen this in the Pacific, where carrier groups launched waves of aircraft that annihilated defending air wings within hours. Yet Normandy revealed the scale. Fleets of planes not only bombarding enemy defenses but also maintaining an air umbrella that ensured German reinforcements could not move freely. American factories had produced over 100,000 aircraft by 1944, numbers so vast they dwarfed Japan's dwindling production, already crippled by shortages of aluminum and fuel. Each American plane was not just a weapon, but a symbol of an industrial engine that seemed endless. Tanks added another dimension. The M4 Sherman, often criticized for its thinner armor compared to German Panthers and Tigers, proved its worth not by superiority in a duel, but by ubiquity and coordination. With over 49,000 built, Shermans rolled off assembly lines like automobiles, their engines tuned for reliability, their radios ensuring cohesion in battle. In Normandy, they pushed inland relentlessly, not as isolated giants, but as coordinated units supported by infantry, engineers, and air power. Japanese commanders, who relied on light tanks such as the Type 95 Hago, undergunned and underarmored, recognized immediately that such numbers, combined with communication, rendered quality arguments meaningless. A single Tiger tank might defeat a Sherman platoon, but 5 more Shermans would arrive before the Tiger could reload. It was not the tank itself. It was the system that supported it, and that system was American industry. Perhaps the most overlooked yet devastating technical advantage was logistics in numbers. American Liberty ships, 441 feet long and capable of carrying 9,000 tons, were built in just 42 days by streamlined assembly techniques. More than 2,700 were launched during the war, each one capable of ferrying supplies across the Atlantic. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace even a fraction of its merchant fleet, sunk relentlessly by American submarines. Each Liberty ship that unloaded at Normandy was another dagger in Tokyo's heart, a reminder that American factories could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. This was war reduced to an equation: tonnage, output, capacity. By 1944, the numbers were all on America's side. For the Japanese High Command, every technical report that arrived from Europe reinforced a single truth: America's strength was systemic. It was not one weapon, not one invention, but the integration of all: radios, ships, aircraft, tanks, supply lines, woven into a war effort that left no weakness exposed. In Tokyo, officers debated whether spirit and determination could overcome such odds, whether kamikaze tactics or fortified islands might slow the advance. Yet the invasion of Normandy offered a cruel answer. The Americans had built a war machine not dependent on individual heroism, but on relentless, mechanical efficiency. Every component, every innovation, every ton of steel moved with a purpose. Against such an enemy, courage alone could not suffice. Normandy was more than a battlefield. It was a display case of American technology, industry, and innovation, each element feeding into the next. For the men who stormed the beaches, it was survival. For Germany, it was a disaster. For Japan, it was a revelation. The moment they understood that the United States was not merely winning battles, but had redefined the very nature of modern war. The winter of 1944 was not merely a season. It was a crucible, shaping the resolve of men and the fate of nations. Snow blanketed the battlefields of Europe, muffling the echoes of artillery, yet leaving an eerie silence that made the crack of a rifle or the rumble of distant armor all the more ominous. The Allies had advanced across France, liberating town after town, but the German war machine was not finished. Far from it. Deep in the forests of the Ardennes, a storm was gathering, one last desperate gamble by Hitler to split the Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a brutal, frozen struggle that tested the endurance of every soldier caught in its grasp. For the men on the front lines, the Ardennes seemed deceptively quiet in December. American troops, many of them young replacements unfamiliar with combat, held positions in small villages and foxholes carved into the hard ground. They were exhausted from months of fighting, grateful for what they believed would be a quiet sector. Letters from home spoke of Christmas, of warmth, of families waiting for their sons to return. But in the dense forests beyond, German panzer divisions, elite SS troops, and thousands of infantry prepared for a sudden, crushing assault. Hitler's plan was audacious: drive through the Ardennes, seize Antwerp, and cut the Allied armies in half. If successful, it could alter the entire course of the war. At dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. The German artillery barrage was deafening, a rolling thunder that pounded American lines without mercy. Shells exploded across snowy fields, shattering trees and burying foxholes in avalanches of dirt and snow. The young soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, many in their first days at the front, were stunned, their defenses crumbling under the sheer ferocity of the onslaught. Waves of German infantry, clad in white camouflage, surged through the mist. The Ardennes had erupted into chaos. Entire American units were cut off, overwhelmed by the ferocity of the German attack. The town of St. Vith, a crucial crossroads, became a focal point of desperate fighting. Tanks clashed in icy streets while infantry battled house to house. Further north, at Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery units fought with a grim determination, pouring fire into advancing German columns. These positions held longer than anyone expected, slowing the enemy's momentum at a critical moment. But in other areas, disaster unfolded. The 106th Division, surrounded and isolated, suffered one of the largest mass surrenders of American troops in the war. Tens of thousands were captured and marched into captivity through snow and hunger. The German advance carved deep into the Allied front, creating the infamous bulge in the line. Yet amid the collapse, acts of courage blazed. In the besieged town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, already battered from months of combat, dug in against overwhelming odds. Supplies were low, medical care nearly non-existent, and winter's grip relentless. But the paratroopers refused to yield. German forces encircled the town, demanding surrender. The reply from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe would echo through history in its simplicity and defiance. Nuts. That single word embodied the spirit of resistance. A refusal to bow even when the situation seemed hopeless. The siege of Bastogne became a symbol of Allied resilience. Airborne units held the line in snow-filled foxholes, fighting off repeated assaults by German tanks and infantry. Food rations dwindled, frostbite spread, and wounded men lay in barns converted into makeshift hospitals. Yet morale somehow held. They believed relief would come, and in late December, it did. General George S. Patton, driving his Third Army north with relentless speed, broke through German lines and relieved Bastogne. The paratroopers had endured, and their stand would be remembered as one of the defining moments of the war. But the cost of the Ardennes campaign was staggering. Both sides suffered immense casualties in the frozen forests and shattered villages. Civilians, caught between advancing and retreating armies, endured unspeakable hardship. The German offensive, though initially devastating, faltered as fuel shortages crippled their armored spearheads. Their once feared tanks were abandoned along snowy roadsides, their engines silent, their crews exhausted. By January 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground, pushing the Germans back across the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last great gamble in the West, and it had failed. The Wehrmacht had expended men, material, and morale it could not afford to lose. The Allies, though bloodied, emerged stronger, their resolve hardened by the brutal test of winter. For the soldiers who survived, the memories of frozen foxholes, desperate firefights, and comrades lost in the snow would never fade. The Ardennes was not simply a battlefield. It was a proving ground of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. As the snows melted and the new year dawned, the war entered its final, savage phase. Germany was weakened but not yet broken, and the path to victory would still demand rivers of blood. The Ardennes, however, marked the turning of the tide. The last offensive of a fading regime had been beaten back, and the road to Berlin lay open. In the frozen forests, amid the ruins of shattered towns, the Allies had shown the world that they would not be stopped. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a clash of armies. It was a struggle of wills, of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. It was about the letters written home, never to be sent. The frozen bodies in the snow were left where they fell. The grit of men who stood their ground when retreat would have been easier. It was a reminder that in war, victory is not measured only in miles gained or cities liberated, but in the resilience of those who refuse to yield. The Ardennes taught the world that even in the darkest winter, the flame of resistance could still burn bright. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich stood on the brink of destruction. The once mighty German war machine was shattered, retreating on all fronts, yet still capable of inflicting immense suffering. In the east, the Soviet Red Army surged relentlessly toward Berlin, while in the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pressed deeper into Germany. The end of the war in Europe was approaching, but the road to final victory would be lined with brutality, devastation, and revelations so harrowing they would scar humanity forever. The crossing of the Rhine River in March symbolized the collapse of Hitler's defenses. For the Allies, it was both a strategic and psychological triumph. German commanders had hoped the river would form a natural barrier, buying time for regrouping. Instead, American troops seized an intact bridge at Remagen, securing a critical foothold on the eastern bank. Engineers rushed to strengthen the bridge under constant artillery fire and air attacks, while divisions poured across in defiance of German desperation. It was a sign that the Reich's last lines of defense were crumbling. From there, Allied armies fanned out, advancing through towns reduced to rubble. Their progress marked by both liberation and destruction as Allied forces pressed forward. They encountered scenes that defied comprehension. In hidden valleys, behind barbed wire, and in towns whispered about, but seldom confirmed, the reality of Nazi atrocities came into the light. Concentration camps, names like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, became synonymous with horror. Soldiers who had seen the worst that battlefields could offer were unprepared for what awaited them inside those gates. Emaciated prisoners staggered forward, skeletal forms with hollow eyes, their liberation both miraculous and heartbreaking. Piles of bodies, evidence of systematic murder, confronted the liberators with a truth too monstrous to ignore. For many soldiers, these camps were the moment the abstract evil of Nazism became real, a searing memory that would never leave them. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Reich descended into chaos. Hitler, ensconced in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, raged against betrayal and fantasized about miracle weapons that would turn the tide. His generals, many already resigned to defeat, faced impossible orders to fight to the last man. The once proud German capital was now a fortress of rubble, defended by exhausted soldiers, old men, and children of the Hitler Youth, thrust into battle with rifles too heavy for their shoulders. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder by the day, its thunder rolling closer, a constant reminder that the Red Army was coming. For the Soviets, the battle for Berlin was both revenge and conquest. They had endured the siege of Leningrad, the bloodbath of Stalingrad, and the destruction of their homeland. Now they marched into Germany with a determination forged in fire and loss. Their assault on Berlin began in April, a massive bombardment that shook the earth. Soviet troops advanced block by block, street by street, paying in blood for every yard of ground. The fighting was savage, the city collapsing under the weight of firepower and fanatic resistance. For civilians, it was hell on earth, bombs falling, buildings collapsing, and fear consuming every hour. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler's delusion deepened. He moved phantom armies on maps, armies that no longer existed. He berated his generals, dismissed reality, and clung to dreams of victory even as the walls of his world closed in. Those closest to him, secretaries, aides, loyalists, watched as the man who had once commanded a continent shrank into a shadow, consumed by paranoia and despair. On April 30th, with Soviet troops just streets away, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His body, hastily burned in the garden above the bunker, was a grim end to the dictator who had plunged the world into darkness. The fall of Berlin marked the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. But fighting raged across the country until May. In villages and forests, in mountain passes and along rivers, German units continued to resist, some out of loyalty, others simply because surrender meant facing the wrath of the victors. Yet one by one, the last holdouts collapsed. On May 7th, in Reims, German representatives signed an unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. The following day, in Berlin, the Soviets accepted their own signing. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe brought an outpouring of celebration across Allied nations. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York, waving flags and embracing strangers. For millions, it was the end of years of fear and sacrifice. Yet the joy was tempered by grief. Empty chairs at family tables, lives cut short, wounds that would never fully heal. Soldiers who had survived now faced the daunting task of returning home, carrying with them memories of comrades lost and horrors witnessed. But the end in Europe was not the end of the war. Across the globe, in the Pacific, Japan remained defiant. American and Allied troops continued to fight brutal battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where casualties mounted with staggering speed. For leaders in Washington, London, and Moscow, the victory over Germany was both a relief and a reminder that one last, formidable enemy remained. The world, weary of bloodshed, still had more to endure. The collapse of Nazi Germany, however, left behind lessons etched in history. It was a testament to the resilience of nations united against tyranny, but also a chilling reminder of how hatred, unchecked, could consume the world. The camps, the ruins, the shattered lives. These were not merely the legacy of one man, but of an ideology that poisoned millions. In the ashes of Berlin, amid the silence left by gunfire, humanity confronted the true cost of its darkest chapter. The war in Europe had ended, but the story of World War II was not yet finished. The final act, fought under a different sun, awaited in the Pacific. And there, decisions would be made that would not only end the war, but also forever change the nature of warfare itself. August 6, 1945. The morning sun rose over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, casting its familiar light across rivers, temples, and wooden homes. Children walked to school. Workers began their day. The city was alive, unaware that within moments, its very existence would be torn apart by a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. At 8:15 a.m., a single American bomber, the Enola Gay, released a device known only by its codename, Little Boy. Seconds later, a blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a wave of destruction that consumed everything in its path. Hiroshima vanished in an instant. Tens of thousands perished in the explosion, and thousands more would die from burns and radiation. For the first time in human history, a single bomb carried the destructive force of an entire fleet. 3 days later, on August 9th, another city faced the same fate. Nagasaki, shrouded in clouds, was struck by the second atomic bomb, Fat Man. The devastation was total. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, lives extinguished in seconds, and survivors scarred for generations. For Japan, the message was clear: resistance meant annihilation. The emperor, breaking centuries of tradition, addressed his people directly, announcing surrender. His voice, weary yet resolute, declared that enduring the unendurable was the only path to survival. On August 15th, Japan accepted unconditional surrender. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over. For soldiers who had fought across Europe and the Pacific, the announcement was surreal. After years of bloodshed, the fighting had stopped. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with disbelief. Could the war truly be finished? In cities across the world, celebrations erupted. Times Square in New York filled with crowds, confetti rained down, and strangers embraced. In London, Big Ben rang as people danced in the streets. In Moscow, fireworks painted the night sky. The world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Yet beneath the celebrations lay an unshakable truth. The war had forever changed humanity. The scale of loss was staggering. More than 60 million lives were gone. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered across continents. From the rubble of Warsaw to the ashes of Dresden, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, the scars of war were everywhere. For survivors, rebuilding would take decades, and for many, the memories would never heal. Soldiers returned home carrying invisible wounds, their minds haunted by battles, their souls marked by what they had seen. Civilians bore the weight of grief and hunger. Nations faced the monumental task of reconstructing not just their cities, but their very sense of humanity. The legacy of World War II extended beyond its destruction. It reshaped the world order. Old empires collapsed, while new powers emerged. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, now faced each other as rivals, their partnership dissolving into suspicion. The Cold War was born in the ashes of Berlin and Hiroshima. The atomic bomb had not only ended a war, it had opened an age defined by nuclear fear. The lesson of Hiroshima echoed through the decades. Humanity now held the power to destroy itself. Yet from the ruins came also the determination to prevent such devastation from ever happening again. The United Nations was formed, an institution dedicated to peace, though imperfect and fragile. In Nuremberg, Nazi leaders were placed on trial, the world demanding accountability for crimes against humanity. The phrase, "never again," entered the conscience of nations, though history would test its sincerity. For those who lived through it, the war was more than strategy and battles. It was personal. A soldier remembered the friend who never came home. A mother mourned the son lost on foreign soil. A child grew up in the shadow of a father's silence, his memories too painful to share. These individual stories, multiplied millions of times, formed the true cost of the conflict. They were the quiet legacies of a war that reached into every home, every family, every generation. Technological innovation had changed the battlefield forever. Tanks, aircraft carriers, jet engines, rockets, and ultimately, nuclear weapons had transformed the very concept of war. No longer was victory defined solely by manpower and courage. It was now about science, engineering, and the ability to harness industry at unimaginable scales. The war had proven that connection, radios, logistics, alliances, could outweigh even the most formidable weapons. From Normandy to Berlin, from Midway to Hiroshima, the side that could adapt, communicate, and mobilize had prevailed. But amid the machinery of war, the human spirit remained the deciding factor. The courage of resistance fighters in occupied cities, the resilience of civilians under bombardment, the determination of soldiers who advanced under fire, not for glory, but for the comrade beside them. These were the threads that bound the vast, tragic tapestry of World War II. They reminded the world that beyond strategy and technology, it was the endurance of ordinary people that ultimately shaped history as the smoke of war cleared. Nations confronted the question of meaning. Why had so many died? What had been achieved at such a cost? For some, the answer lay in liberation, the defeat of tyranny, the end of genocide, and the promise of a future built on freedom. For others, the devastation overshadowed victory, a haunting reminder of how close humanity had come to losing itself entirely. The war had revealed both the depths of cruelty and the heights of sacrifice. It had shown humanity at its worst and at its best. In the decades that followed, the world would wrestle with the legacy of those years. Every battlefield cemetery, every monument, every photograph of starving prisoners or jubilant liberators carried the same warning. Remember. Remember what happens when hate is given power, when ambition blinds leaders, and when silence allows evil to grow. Remember the cost, so that it may never be repeated. And yet, the shadow of World War II remains. Its lessons are written into the strategies of modern armies, the diplomacy of nations, and the fears of citizens. Its images still haunt, and its stories still inspire. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Hiroshima, the war speaks across generations. It is not distant history. It is the foundation of the world we live in today. In the end, World War II was not simply a clash of armies. It was a battle for the soul of humanity. It revealed the fragility of civilization, but also its resilience. It proved that even in the darkest hour, courage can rise, hope can endure, and freedom can prevail. And so, the voice of history echoes across time with a truth forged in fire. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. But above all, it is unity, sacrifice, and memory that ensure tyranny never reigns unchallenged again.